Imagine trying to buy a shipment of silk or maybe a cartload of iron tools,
Right.
but you literally cannot carry the money required to pay for it.
Like physically carry it.
Exactly, physically. I don't mean you don't have enough money in your bank account. I mean the physical weight of the coins is so staggeringly heavy that you'd need like a fleet of wheelbarrows.
Wheelbarrows guarded by armed mercenaries, probably.
Yeah, exactly, just to
Yeah.
transport your cash down the street. It's this massive logistical nightmare that honestly threatens to completely break your booming economy.
It's a great visual.
Right. And that was the actual reality in 11th century China. And, their solution to that problem was just one of a dozen innovations that completely rewired human history.
It really did.
So welcome to the deep dive. For you listening, we are exploring the Song Dynasty of China, which is this incredible period spanning from 960 to 1279.
A fascinating era.
Truly. We're working from a really comprehensive stack of historical sources here. And our mission for this deep dive is to understand how a dynasty, one that is unfortunately mostly famous for its eventual pretty catastrophic defeat by the Mongols.
Right, that's what everyone remembers.
Exactly. How they quietly engineered an economic, scientific, and societal revolution. I mean, we're talking about the invention of paper money, discovering the true north with the magnetic compass, weaponizing gunpowder, all while Europe was still, slogging through the middle of the Middle Ages.
Yeah, it is a phenomenal period to study, largely because it just completely challenges our assumptions about how progress happens.
Totally.
To set the stage for you, we really need to look at the broad timeline and the political reality of the era. So the dynasty was founded in 960 by Emperor Taizu.
Okay.
And before he took power, China was fracturing through this incredibly chaotic era. It was aptly named the Five Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period.
It's just total warlord fragmentation.
Total fragmentation, yeah. Taizu was actually a general serving the later Zhou dynasty, and he basically usurped the throne in a military coup.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he established the Song and then just methodically conquered the remaining independent kingdoms, reunifying China proper.
Okay, so he brings it all back together.
Right. Now, this 3-century run we're looking at, it's cleanly split by historians into two distinct eras. You have the Northern Song from 960 to 1127.
And they ruled from their massive capital in the north, right? Kaifeng.
Exactly, Kaifeng. And then, following a really devastating invasion that cost them the entire northern half of their territory.
That's wild.
It is. After that, you have the Southern Song from 1127 to 1279, and they're operating out of a new, arguably even more vibrant capital in the south, which was Hangzhou.
The story of how they lost the north is just mind-blowing to me, and we are absolutely going to get into the military blunders that caused it.
Oh, we have to.
But, if you're listening to this, you're probably wondering how they managed to invent all these foundational modern technologies in the first place. Because you don't get astronomical clocks and forensic science without a massive foundation of wealth.
You really don't.
So to understand how they funded this utopia, we have to look at the ground level. Like, literally, the dirt. How did they feed a population that was just exploding in size?
The demographic shift is staggering. I mean, between the 10th and 11th centuries, China's population doubled.
Doubled.
The sources estimate they hit somewhere between 90 and 110 million people in the Northern Song alone.
That's insane.
Yeah, which breaks down to roughly 20 million households.
100 million people in the 11th century. I mean, that completely eclipses the legendary Han and Tang dynasties.
It completely dwarfs them. And, population growth on that scale, it doesn't happen by accident, nor does it happen just because people are having more children. It requires a fundamental shift in agricultural carrying capacity. The catalyst here is something that sounds, incredibly mundane, but it literally altered the course of human history.
The rice.
The rice. In 1011, Emperor Zhenzong introduced a specific strain of rice to China, which was champa rice.
Yeah, I was reading about this in the sources. This came as a tribute from the Kingdom of Champa, which is located in modern-day Vietnam, right?
Yes, exactly. And the emperor didn't just accept it as a neat curiosity. His administration actively distributed the seeds to farmers all across the Yangtze Delta.
Just handed them out.
And the reason champa rice was so revolutionary comes down to its biology. Traditional strains of Chinese rice, they generally yielded one harvest a year,
Okay.
and they required a massive amount of water. So if you had a drought, or if the monsoon rains were late, you faced famine. It was precarious.
Right, you're just at the mercy of the weather.
But champa rice, however, was highly drought resistant, and it matured remarkably fast.
Fast enough that you aren't just getting one crop out of the ground before winter.
Exactly. It grew fast enough to offer 2 full harvests a year instead of 1.
So you are literally doubling the food supply on the exact same plot of land.
Yes.
And because you mentioned it's drought resistant, I assume that means you don't necessarily need the perfect, flooded paddy fields in the lowlands to grow it.
That is the secondary and perhaps even more important benefit. Because it required less water, farmers could begin cultivating it on terraced hillsides.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, up in higher elevations where water wasn't as easily regulated. So they were expanding the total amount of arable land while simultaneously doubling the yield of the land they already had.
That's incredible.
It creates this widespread, consistent food surplus.
And this is where the domino effect starts, isn't it?
It is the ultimate domino. I mean, think about it. When an entire family doesn't have to work in the fields from dawn until dusk just to survive the winter, you free up human capital.
Right, people can do other things.
Exactly. You get specialization. People can move to cities. They can become full-time artisans, scholars, merchants, engineers. This agricultural surplus fomented a total economic revolution in pre-modern China.
The economic metrics we have from this period are just absurd. I mean, the Song Dynasty GDP was estimated to be 3 times larger than the GDP of all of Europe during the 12th century.
3 times. It's hard to wrap your head around.
They were experiencing what we can only really describe as an early industrial revolution. The numbers on their iron production really stood out to me in the sources. They were producing 100 million kilograms.
Yeah.
That's 220 million pounds of iron products per year.
Which is a level of industrial output that Europe wouldn't see until, the 1700s?
Yeah.
And the sheer mechanics of producing that much iron are fascinating. Historically, to smelt iron in blast furnaces, you need incredible heat.
Yeah.
And that heat came from charcoal.
Yeah.
If you are producing 220 million pounds of iron a year using charcoal, you are going to systematically cut down every single tree in your empire.
Which would be an ecological catastrophe.
Total deforestation. But the Sun engineers managed to largely avoid that disaster.
Ow.
In the 11th century, they innovated the widespread use of bituminous coal instead of charcoal in their blast furnaces.
Oh, but that makes sense.
Yeah, they dug massive mines, established complex logistical networks of canals to transport the coal to the foundries, and fundamentally shifted their industrial energy source.
So you have these massive coal-fired foundries churning out millions of pounds of iron tools, weapons, structural materials. You have farmers pulling 2 harvests a year out of the ground. The economy is running so hot that it actually causes a massive physical problem with their currency.
A weight issue.
Exactly, which brings us back to that wheelbarrow of coins I mentioned at the very start of the show.
The currency crisis of the Song dynasty is one of the most interesting economic problems in history, I think.
Tell me about it.
So the standard currency was the Chinese cash coin. You know, those round copper or bronze coins with the square holes in the middle so you could string them together.
All right, you string a bunch on a cord.
Exactly. By the year 1085, the government foundries were minting roughly 6 billion of these copper coins annually.
6 billion physical coins. I tried to do the math on the weight of that, and it just breaks the brain.
It's massive.
If you are a merchant doing large-scale wholesale trade,
Right.
like buying a massive shipment of that iron or bulk tea or silk, you can't just carry a purse of coins. The metal alone would weigh thousands of pounds.
The physical limitations of metal currency were choking the velocity of trade. The economy literally wanted to move faster than the copper could physically be transported.
Wow.
And this bottleneck forced a massive innovation, which was the invention of jiaozi, the world's first government-issued paper money.
I really want to spend some time here because it's so easy for us to take paper money for granted today. We use it every day. But if you think about it, making this transition requires a massive psychological leap.
A huge leap of faith.
Think about when our modern world transitioned to credit cards, for you listening, or when cryptocurrency was first introduced. It is profoundly difficult to convince someone that a piece of plastic or invisible code on a screen holds the exact same value as a physical dollar bill.
Right.
The Song government had to convince a population of 100 million people to look at a flimsy printed piece of paper and trust that it held the value of heavy, tangible copper.
Hmm.
How did they actually enforce that trust?
It requires an immense amount of faith in the state, obviously, but it also requires brilliant administration to prevent that faith from collapsing.
Yeah.
Now, promissory notes and localized letters of credit had existed before, usually managed by private merchant guilds in the Sichuan capital of Chengdu. But true, standardized, government-backed paper currency intended for everyday transactions across an entire empire, that was entirely new.
How do you stop people from just painting their own paper money in their basement? Counterfeiting must have been the immediate fear.
Oh, absolutely. Which is why the mechanics of creating the jiaozi were highly sophisticated. The Song government eventually took over the system entirely and established massive state-run printing factories in cities like Hangzhou and Chengdu.
Factories just for money.
Yeah, and they didn't just use standard bamboo paper. They used specialized paper, sometimes incorporating silk or specific fibers to give it a very unique texture.
Oh, like the cotton and linen blend in modern U.S. dollars.
Exactly like that. And the printing process itself was a security measure. They used multiple wood blocks to print the notes in at least 3 different colors of ink, usually red, black, and blue.
Okay.
The notes featured incredibly intricate designs, depictions of houses, trees, people, alongside complex state-mandated seals and signatures from high-ranking officials. And the penalty for counterfeiting, by the way, was decapitation.
Well, that is quite the deterrent.
Very effective.
The scale of this operation must have been huge, though.
It was. We have records from 1175 showing that the factory at Hangzhou alone employed more than 1,000 workers every single day, just printing paper money.
And this wasn't just a neat technological trick.
Yeah.
The sources emphasize that this booming economy was actually the result of a deliberate change in government philosophy, too.
Yes.
Because in the earlier Tang dynasty, the government was deeply involved in regulating commercial markets.
Yes.
Like telling people when and where they could trade. But the Song government backed off.
They really did. Economic historians point to this toleration of market mechanisms as the major driver of Song prosperity. The state essentially allowed private enterprise to take the wheel.
Interesting.
You see the emergence of complex joint stock companies where wealthy individuals would pool their funds to invest in a fleet of merchant sailing vessels.
Oh, spreading the risk.
Exactly, spreading the immense financial risk of a shipwreck across dozens of investors. Artisans and merchants formed powerful guilds to negotiate taxes with the government and set market prices.
So you have this booming, largely deregulated paper money economy spanning millions of square kilometers. But if the emperor isn't micromanaging the markets, someone still has to manage the infrastructure, right? The courts, the tax collection, the massive logistical networks of canals and roads.
Yeah, you need administrators.
You can't run a society that complex with just a royal family and a handful of aristocratic warlords.
Mm-hmm.
You need a massive, highly capable bureaucracy.
And that brings us to one of the most defining characteristics of the Song dynasty. It was the deliberate, systemic shift from a military aristocratic elite to a scholar bureaucratic elite.
The civil service exams.
Yes. The examination system had existed on a smaller scale in earlier dynasties, but under the Song, it became virtually the only legitimate path to political power and social prestige.
I read that the scale of this system expanded exponentially. The sources note that the number of candidates taking the low-level prefectural exams, which is, just the first rung in the ladder.
Just the beginning, yeah.
Right. It rose from about 30,000 men annually in the early 11th century to nearly 400,000 candidates by the late 13th century.
Which represents an incredible societal shift toward the concept of meritocracy. The fundamental idea was to staff the state apparatus based on rigorous intellectual skill and administrative merit, rather than simply handing a governorship to the emperor's cousin or some powerful general's son.
I really want to dig into the mechanics of these exams, because calling them an exam feels like calling a marathon a brisk walk.
That's a good way to put it.
What did it actually take to compete in this system?
It was a grueling, lifelong endeavor. Boys would begin memorizing the foundational Confucian classics, poetry, historical texts from around the age of 5.
5 years old.
5. By the time they were young men, they were expected to not only have these texts perfectly memorized, but to be able to compose complex, highly structured essays and poetry, analyzing political theory, ethics, and statecraft.
And the actual physical process of taking the test was brutal, wasn't it?
Extremely. Candidates would travel to testing centers where they would be searched for hidden notes, sometimes even having their seams unstitched by guards.
Just to check for cheat sheets.
Exactly. They were locked into tiny individual open-air cells for days at a time. They slept, ate, and wrote in that single cramped cell.
Wow.
And the pressure was immense because passing the exams meant guaranteed wealth, status, and power for your entire extended family. Failing, which the vast majority did, meant deep social embarrassment.
But logically, if you have 400,000 people preparing for these exams every year, the sheer demand for study materials must have been astronomical.
Huge demand.
Hand copying the Confucian classics for 500,000 students is just impossible.
Which is precisely why this meritocratic explosion aligns perfectly with another monumental song innovation, the printing press.
Yeah, when most of us hear printing press, we immediately think of Johannes Gutenberg in Germany in the 1440s.
Right.
But the Song dynasty beat him to the punch by roughly 4 centuries.
They did. Now, traditional woodblock printing, where you carve an entire page of text into a single block of wood that had been used in China for a long time.
Okay.
But in the 11th century, an artisan named Bi Sheng invented movable type printing.
How exactly did his system work? Because the Chinese language doesn't have a 26-letter alphabet. It has thousands of unique characters.
That is the genius of Bi Sheng's system, which, by the way, was meticulously recorded by the scientist Shen Ku. Bi Sheng carved individual Chinese characters out of moist clay and then baked them in a fire to make them hard and durable.
Play type, okay.
Yeah. When a printer wanted to set a page, they would take a large iron plate covered in a mixture of pine resin, wax, and paper ashes. They would arrange the baked clay characters on the plate within an iron frame to form the text.
Oh, I see.
Then they would gently heat the plate so the resin melted slightly, pressing a flat board against the top of the characters to ensure they were perfectly level. Once the resin cooled and hardened, the block was solid and ready for printing.
That's amazing.
And when they were done, they just reheated the plate, popped the characters off, and reused them for the next book.
It is brilliant. The efficiency of that is staggering. You don't have to carve a new block for every single page of every single book. You just rearrange the clay type.
Exactly.
And the result of this technology is that books, manuals on agriculture, medical texts, poetry, and especially the study guides for the civil service exams became significantly cheaper to mass produce.
It democratized knowledge on a scale the world had never seen. The spread of printed material drastically expanded the literate public. It basically created a massive new social class, the local scholar gentry.
Right, because if 400,000 people are taking the exams, but the central government only has spots for, say, 20,000 active officials across the whole empire, you have hundreds of thousands of highly educated men who don't get an official government job.
Exactly.
What do?
They become the glue that holds local society together. Remember, the central government had withdrawn from heavily regulating local commerce. They needed people on the ground to manage daily life.
Sure.
This larger scholarly gentry class, which included degree holders waiting for an appointment, retired officials, and those who failed the higher exams but still had an elite education, they stepped into the vacuum.
So they just took over local affairs.
Yeah, they supervised local markets, funded private academies, repaired bridges, managed local charities. They became the unofficial administrators of the empire's vast grassroots network.
So on paper, this sounds like an enlightened utopia. You have a nation run by brilliant scholars reading cheap printed books, governing locally through mutual cooperation, while the economy hums along on paper money.
It sounds great.
But I have to challenge this narrative, because if you actually look at the imperial court in Kaifeng during this time, it is not a calm, rational utopia. If these officials were so hyper-educated and enlightened, why was the central government constantly paralyzed by toxic, vicious partisanship?
That is the inevitable dark side of this specific type of hyper-competitive bureaucratic system. I mean, think about the psychology here. You have an entire ruling class selected through grueling, high-stakes intellectual debate and rigorous policy exams.
Right.
These are men who have spent their entire lives convinced of their own intellectual supremacy. When you put hundreds of them in the capital and ask them how to manage a rapidly changing economy and a massive population, you are going to get strong, divergent, and completely uncompromising opinions.
They were debating the fundamental role of government.
Yes, and this debate birthed intense political factionalism. The most famous example of this gridlock centers around Chancellor Wang Anshi in the 11th century.
Okay, what did he do?
Well, Wang Anshi looked at the state bureaucracy, saw inefficiency, corruption, a neglect of the peasantry, and pushed through a massive slate of reforms known as the New Policies.
What was he trying to change specifically?
Almost everything. He implemented land value tax reforms to ensure wealthy landowners paid their fair share. He established government monopolies on certain goods to increase state revenue.
Okay.
He set up systems to offer low-interest loans to poor farmers so they wouldn't get crushed by predatory private money lenders. He even changed the criteria for the civil service exams, demanding that candidates focus more on practical statecraft, economics, and law, rather than just reciting ancient poetry.
Which, I mean, sounds incredibly modern and pragmatic,
Well,
but I assume the establishment did not like this.
they despised it. Wang Anshi's New Policies Group, the reformers, immediately clashed with the conservative faction, which was led by the prominent historian Sima Guang.
So, classic political rivalry.
Very much so. The conservatives believed Wang Anshi was destroying the foundational traditions of the state, expanding government overreach, and destroying the private economy.
And this wasn't just a polite debate in the Senate chamber, was it? The sources describe this factionalism as incredibly vindictive. As one faction gained the ear of the emperor and took the majority in the court, they would systematically purge their rivals.
They would demote rival officials, strip them of their rank, and exile them to govern remote, miserable, disease-ridden frontier regions in the Deep South. It was total political warfare.
The famous poet and statesman Su Shi is the best example of this. He was a brilliant mind, but because he wrote poems that vaguely criticized some of Wang Anshi's reforms, he was literally jailed, put on trial for his life, and eventually exiled.
Right, over a poem.
It's a sobering reminder that a system based on meritocracy and education doesn't magically erase human ego, paranoia, or the desire for political vengeance.
It's also vital to look critically at the concept of this meritocracy itself, honestly. The historians in our sources have a fierce debate about this. Scholars like Edward Crack and Ho Pingti point out that the exam system genuinely offered unprecedented social mobility.
Right, because anyone could technically take the exam.
Exactly. We have records showing that in some exam years, a significant percentage of the passing candidates came from families who had never held official status before.
A farm boy could theoretically become the prime minister.
Theoretically, yes. But other historians, like Robert Hartwell and Robert Himes, argue that we shouldn't romanticize it too much. The system heavily favored the already wealthy land-holding elite.
Because of the cost of education, obviously.
Exactly. Preparing for these exams took decades of rigorous, uninterrupted study. Only wealthy families could afford to buy the extensive libraries of printed books, hire the best private tutors,
Yeah.
and, most importantly, absorb the massive opportunity costs of allowing their sons to study all day, every day, instead of working in the fields or managing the family business.
So it's a meritocracy, but it's a race where the wealthy get to start 10 miles ahead of the poor.
That's a perfect analogy.
Despite the flaws and the toxic politics, though, this hyper-educated scholar class didn't just spend all their time arguing about taxes and poetry. Their insatiable curiosity, fostered by that very education system, bled into the physical sciences.
Yes, it did.
And the minds produced by this song system rivaled, and in many cases predated, the great polymaths of the European Renaissance like Leonardo da Vinci.
The intellectual output of the song polymaths is truly astounding. They were driven by a core tenet of Neo-Confucian philosophy, which encouraged investigating things to extend knowledge.
Right.
They didn't see science, art, philosophy, and engineering as separate, siloed disciplines. To understand the cosmos was to understand engineering. To understand history was to understand geology.
We have to talk about Shen Ku. He lived from 1031 to 1095, and this guy's resume is unbelievable. He was a finance minister, a state inspector, an astronomer, a diplomat, and a military general.
He did everything.
But his scientific discoveries are what truly blow my mind.
Shen Ku is one of the most brilliant observational scientists in history. Let's start with navigation. While experimenting with a magnetic compass, which the Chinese had been using in various forms for a while, Shen Ku was the first person in recorded history to discern the concept of magnetic declination.
What exactly does that mean in practice, like for someone navigating a ship?
So, if you hold a magnetic compass, the needle points north, but it doesn't point to the exact geographical North Pole, the axis the Earth spins on. It points to the magnetic North Pole, which is slightly off.
Okay, I follow.
Shen Ku noticed this discrepancy. He realized the needle pointed slightly east of true north. Understanding magnetic declination is absolutely foundational for accurate, long-distance maritime navigation.
Because you drift off course otherwise.
Exactly. If you don't account for that slight angle, you will sail hundreds of miles off course over a long journey.
And he figured this out in the 11th century. That's wild. But he didn't stop at magnets. The sources say he formulated an early theory of climate change.
Yes. He was inspecting a region in the arid north, near the Yellow River, and he discovered petrified bamboo underground.
Bamboo.
Bamboo. Now, bamboo requires a warm, wet climate to grow, and this region was dry and cold. Instead of just ignoring it, Shenku deduced that the geographical climate of that specific region must have gradually shifted over thousands of years.
That's incredible deductive reasoning.
Yeah.
He also formed a theory of land formation, right?
Correct. He observed fossilized marine shells in a geological stratum running through a mountain range hundreds of miles from the ocean. He reasoned that the land must have been formed over enormous spans of time by the deposit of silt and uplift from an ancient seashore.
Which is spot on.
It aligns perfectly with modern geomorphology. He also performed optical experiments with a camera obscura, understanding how light passing through a pinhole projects an inverted image just decades after the Islamic scholar Ibn al-Haytham was studying the same phenomena.
I love that he was also an archaeologist, but he approached it with an engineer's mindset. The sources mention that among the scholar elite, it was trendy to collect ancient bronze vessels from the Shang and Zhou dynasties to use in state rituals.
Right, as status symbols.
Yeah, but Shenko actively criticized his peers for this. He didn't care about how pretty the antiques were. He studied these ancient relics to reverse engineer their manufacturing processes. He wanted to know the metallurgy, the casting techniques. He wanted to know how the ancients made things.
He took a completely interdisciplinary approach to the physical world. And then you have his contemporary, Susang, who achieved something arguably even more visibly spectacular.
A clock tower.
The clock tower. Susang was a statesman and an astronomer best known for a monumental achievement in horology, which is the science of timekeeping. In 1092, he published a treatise detailing his masterpiece, a hydraulic-powered, 39-foot-tall astronomical clock tower built in the capital of Kaifeng.
39 feet tall. That is essentially a 4-story building that operates as the single massive clock.
Yeah.
How did it actually work?
It was driven by a massive water wheel, but the genius was how they controlled the water. If water just pours continuously over a wheel, it spins uncontrollably.
Right.
Susong's clock featured an early, intermittently working escapement mechanism.
I've heard that term regarding watches. What is an escapement mechanism?
Think of it as a mechanical latch. The water fills a bucket on the wheel. Once the bucket hits a specific weight, the mechanism trips, releasing the latch, allowing the wheel to turn exactly one notch forward and then catching it again.
Tick-tock.
Tick-tock! It captures continuous energy and portions it out into precise, measurable, consistent increments. This mechanism ensured the clock kept near-perfect time. This is centuries before the verge escapement appeared in mechanical clocks in Europe.
And it wasn't just a giant dial with hands. The descriptions of this thing in the sources are wild.
The tower was incredibly complex. At the top, under a weather cover, was a massive bronze armillary sphere.
What's that?
It's a physical, mechanical model of the heavens made of interlocking metal rings that rotated in sync with the actual movement of the stars. Below that was a celestial globe. And on the front of the tower was a rotating gear wheel featuring 133 wooden clock-jack mannequins dressed in different colored robes.
Like a giant cuckoo clock.
Exactly like that. As the gears turned, these mannequins would rotate past shuttered windows, ringing gongs, banging drums, holding up wooden announcement plaques to tell the citizens the exact time of day.
That is just a stunning piece of civic art and engineering.
Yeah.
And didn't Susong also map the stars?
He did. He published a printed celestial atlas comprising 5 detailed star charts. What's fascinating is the cartography he used. The sources note these charts used a cylindrical projection method, which preserves the accurate position of the stars relative to the equator. It is mathematically very similar to the Mercator projection.
The map projection we use today.
The very same, which Gerardus Mercator didn't innovate in Europe until 1569.
The mechanical engineering of the era wasn't just restricted to massive clock towers either. They were applying these complex gears to transportation and logistics. I want to talk about the mechanical odometer and the south-pointing chariot because the technology here blew my mind.
The mechanical odometer was used to measure distance for the empire, which is vital for taxation, map-making, paying couriers.
Sure.
It was a wheeled carriage with a complex array of gearwork inside, driven by the physical rotation of the carriage wheels on the ground.
So as the carriage rolls, the axle turns a gear, which turns another gear.
Precisely. And they geared it so precisely that every time the carriage traveled a specific unit of distance, a Chinese lie, a mechanical arm would physically strike a drum.
Wow.
When it traveled 10 li, another arm would strike a bell. It was an auditory distance measuring machine.
But they combined this odometer carriage with another device called a south-pointing chariot, which is where things get really crazy.
Yeah.
You'd think a south-pointing chariot would just have a big magnetic compass on it. But they didn't use magnets. They used a mechanical differential gear.
Yes. Which is incredible.
I want everyone listening to picture the axle of the car you drive today. When you take a sharp turn, the outside wheel has to travel a further distance and therefore spin faster than the inside wheel.
Right.
If both wheels were locked to a solid axle, the car would hop and skip across the pavement. A differential gear is a cluster of gears in the middle of the axle that allows the two wheels to rotate at different speeds while still receiving power. The song engineers used this exact same differential gear concept in the 11th century.
It's just phenomenal.
They geared the wheels of the chariot so that no matter how the vehicle turned, twisted, or looped around, a wooden figure mounted on the top would rotate in perfect countersynchronization, always pointing south.
It is a stunning testament to their intuitive grasp of complex kinematics and mechanical engineering. And they didn't just build neat gadgets, They applied this engineering prowess to massive infrastructure projects that transformed the landscape. Think about the logistics of moving that 100 million kilograms of iron or the millions of bushels of champa rice or the coal. You can't move that bulk on dirt roads. You need canals.
But canals aren't perfectly flat. The terrain changes elevation.
Which is a huge problem. Before the Song Dynasty, navigating a change in water elevation on a canal meant using a slipway. You essentially had to attach ropes to a heavy barge and physically drag it up a ramp from the lower water level to the higher water level.
Which sounds incredibly dangerous.
It was exhausting, painfully slow, and frequently resulted in broken ropes, smashed ships, lost cargo. But in 984, an engineer named Kiaweo pioneered the invention of the canal pound lock.
How does a pound lock work?
It's essentially a water elevator. Instead of a ramp, you build a walled chamber in the canal with massive gates at both ends. If a boat is coming from the lower level, it sails into the chamber and you close the gate behind it.
Okay.
Then you open a valve to let water from the higher elevation flood into the closed chamber.
So the boat just floats upward as the chamber fills.
Exactly. Once the water level inside the chamber matches the higher elevation of the canal ahead, you open the front gate and the boat sails on. It completely eliminated the danger of slipways, allowed for vastly larger and heavier barges, and supercharged the logistical capacity of the empire.
They were also mastering vertical architecture. The sources mention the Liaodi Pagoda in Hebei, built in 1055, which stands at an incredible 276 feet tall.
Massive.
Building a masonry structure that tall requires serious mathematical rigor.
And they standardized that rigor. The government didn't want amateur builders collapsing bridges and towers. In 1103, an architect and state official named Li Ji compiled the Yingzhou Fashi, which is essentially a comprehensive standard building code.
A building code in the 12th century.
Yes. It detailed strict architectural proportions, structural engineering principles, and provided exact formulas for mortar and masonry construction.
So you have these high-level engineering feats, scientific discoveries, economic booms, but none of this is happening in a vacuum. These canals, clocks, and building codes were serving what were, at the time, the largest and most complex cities on Earth.
Yeah.
Which brings us to what daily life was actually like.
The urbanization during the Song Dynasty reached unprecedented levels. The capitals, first Kaifeng in the north and later Hangzhou in the south, were megacities. They boasted populations of over 1 million people each.
To put that in perspective, London and Paris during this exact same period had populations of maybe 30,000 to 50,000 people.
A tiny fraction.
A city of 1 million people requires immense logistical, social, and legal infrastructure simply not to collapse in on itself from disease, starvation, or crime.
The sheer density of human life forced a change in how society operated, and the daily life described in the sources sounds surprisingly modern and incredibly vibrant. Because you have a prosperous, dense population with money to spend, you see the explosion of a massive entertainment and service industry.
The sources describe massive theater districts. There were puppeteers, acrobats, snake charmers, sword swallowers. The 4 largest drama theaters in Kaifeng could hold audiences of several thousand people each.
And the culinary scene was vast. This wasn't a society subsisting purely on boiled rice.
No.
Song restaurant and tavern menus that have survived reveal a lavish, highly diverse diet Particularly for the upper and middle classes, you had distinct regional cuisines. Restaurants served everything from braised duck and shrimp to more exotic meats like fallow deer, quail, fox, and badger.
Badger. I can't even imagine eating badger. But it wasn't just restaurants. You had people attending specialized social clubs.
Yes, the social club culture was huge. If you had an interest, there was an association for it. There were tea clubs where aficionados would sample and rate different regional teas.
Very civilized.
There were exotic food clubs, antiquarian and art collectors clubs where people would show off their ancient bronze vessels, and poetry clubs where scholars would drink wine and compose verses.
It sounds like a fantastic place to live. But with 1 million people, you're also going to have extreme poverty.
You are. But again, the density necessitated a new social contract. The government and the local wealthy gentry recognized that extreme untreated poverty in a dense city leads to plague and riots.
Which is bad for business.
Exactly. So they supported extensive public welfare programs. The state established public retirement homes for the elderly who had no family, public clinics and hospitals for the sick, and paupers' graveyards to ensure the poor received proper burials.
The sources also detail some really interesting shifts in gender dynamics. Now, it's crucial to state clearly that Song society was still fundamentally a patriarchy, heavily governed by Neo-Confucian ethics. Men held the political power.
Right, we can't ignore that.
However, women enjoyed significant social and legal privileges that we don't always associate with this era.
Right. As society became more prosperous, the economic dynamics of marriage changed. Brides' families began providing much larger dowries to secure good matches. Because women were bringing substantial wealth into the marriage, they naturally gained new legal rights in property ownership.
Interesting.
For instance, the legal code stipulated that under certain circumstances, an unmarried daughter without brothers could legally inherit half of her father's share of undivided family property.
That is a massive legal right for the time.
It is. Women were also highly educated, particularly in the upper classes. It was common practice for mothers to be the primary educators of their sons in their early youth, teaching them reading and classical literature before they went to formal tutors.
I read about that.
Yeah, Shen Kuo, the brilliant scientist we discussed earlier, was actually taught the essentials of military strategy by his mother. And you have exceptional women writers who achieved massive fame in their own lifetimes, like the poet Li Qingzhao, whose works are still celebrated today.
So we have a society of 1 million people packed together in Kaifeng, navigating complex business deals, property inheritance, social clubs, bustling markets. With all those people living in close proximity, rubbing shoulders, you were inevitably going to get disputes, violence, and crime.
Absolutely.
And this is a crucial point. You can't rely on village gossip or the local elder to solve a murder in a city of 1 million people where everyone is a stranger. You need an objective system. And this leads to a monumental shift in justice and the birth of forensic science.
The Song judicial system was a massive bureaucracy in itself. It relied on officially appointed magistrates to oversee court cases and conduct investigations. Now, they still used harsh physical punishments, and they did use judicial torture like caning to extract confessions.
Right.
However, the process of determining guilt before the punishment became increasingly empirical and standardized.
They wanted physical proof.
They did. And the most stunning example of this empirical shift comes from a physician and judge named Song Xi. Between 1186 and 1249, he wrote a pioneering, comprehensive work of forensic science called The Washing Away of Wrongs.
I looked at the details of this book, and it is basically a 13th century CSI manual.
It truly is the foundation of forensic pathology. It was a detailed guide designed for coroners and magistrates on how to perform proper post-mortem autopsies to determine the exact cause of death.
Because he didn't trust witnesses.
Right. Song Xi understood that eyewitness testimony is often flawed or biased, and he believed the body held the objective truth.
He detailed how to tell the difference between different types of violence, right?
Yes. For example, he taught investigators how to differentiate between a victim who was strangled and a victim who drowned. He noted that a drowning victim would have water and silt in their lungs and stomach,
Okay, sure.
whereas someone who was strangled and then thrown into the river to fake a drowning would not. He detailed how to look for defensive wounds, how to detect specific types of poisons based on the discoloration of the corpse, and how to analyze blunt force trauma.
He stressed the absolute necessity of proper coroner's conduct, too.
He insisted that autopsies be conducted immediately, outdoors in the sunlight for good visibility. He mandated that coroners must personally wash the body and inspect it themselves rather than relying on lower-level assistance, and he insisted that official clerks accurately and meticulously record the inquests in standardized reports.
The sources suggest this empirical approach in the justice system might have been spurred on by scientists like Shen Kuo, who were arguing against traditional Chinese beliefs in anatomy and pushing for more investigative look at the physical world.
It makes sense.
It marks a huge shift from purely testimonial or superstitious justice to empirical forensic science.
It is the hallmark of a highly evolved administration that values investigation, standard protocols, and written records.
If you are listening to this right now, I want you to take a step back and look at the picture we've painted. We are talking about a civilization in the 11th and 12th centuries with a booming paper money economy, a massive educated bureaucratic class, 39-foot mechanical astronomical clocks, canal pound locks, vibrant megacities with exotic restaurants, property rights for women, empirical forensic autopsies.
It's breathtaking.
It sounds invincible, which leads to the massive glaring question. With all this wealth, art, and complex urban living, didn't they become a massive glowing target for the nomadic empires to the north?
Well, yes.
If they were so advanced, how on earth did they eventually fall to the Mongols? How did they defend this utopia?
That question brings us to the great tragic paradox of the Song dynasty. Because on paper, they should have been completely unconquerable. They possessed the most advanced, terrifying military technology in the world, yet they structurally, deliberately crippled their own armed forces.
It's wild.
Let's look at the technology first, because it is horrifying.
The Song dynasty is the first society in human history to truly weaponize gunpowder. The Wujing Zongyao, a comprehensive military manuscript compiled in 1044, provides the first known written chemical formulas for gunpowder.
And they weren't just making pretty fireworks for the emperor. They developed devastating weapons. They invented fire lances, which were essentially early flamethrowers.
Flamethrowers.
Yeah, they attached bamboo or iron tubes to the end of spears, packed them with gunpowder and shrapnel like bits of pottery or iron shards, and discharged a blast of flame and shrapnel directly into the faces of enemy infantry.
They had explosives, too.
Yes, they had explosive grenades, strong iron-cased bombshells that would shatter upon ignition, creating lethal fragmentation. They used massive traction trebuchets to launch these explosives over city walls during sieges.
That would be terrifying to face.
Beyond gunpowder, they employed massive, highly disciplined units of crossbowmen. They developed complex crank-operated crossbows that acted as long-range snipers, which were incredibly effective at piercing armor and breaking up nomadic cavalry charges.
We're talking about an army that, at its height, numbered up to 1 million soldiers. 1 million men armed with crossbows and explosives. So why was their military considered weak by their enemies? Why were they constantly on the defensive?
To understand the weakness, we have to look back at the very beginning, the founding of the dynasty. Remember Emperor Taizu? How did he get the throne?
He was a general who staged a military coup.
Exactly. And because of that original sin, the entire Song political system was intentionally, structurally designed to prevent another military coup. The civilian imperial court in Kaifeng was absolutely terrified of its own generals.
Deep, systemic paranoia.
Paranoia that dictated national security. The civilian scholar officials, the guys passing those grueling exams, actively looked down on the military. They viewed soldiers as a lower class, a necessary evil at best.
Right.
Structurally, the Northern Song's military council operated under a civilian chancellor who had zero direct control over the actual imperial army. The army itself was deliberately divided among 3 independent marshals, and they all reported only to the emperor.
And since the emperor rarely led campaigns himself, you have a massive army that lacks any unified command or strategic cohesion on the battlefield.
Furthermore, the government was so terrified that a successful, brilliant general would become a popular hero and usurp the throne that they routinely relieved, exiled, or even executed their own best commanders if they became too successful.
Just killed them.
The sources explicitly mention the tragic execution of renowned generals like Yu Fei. They literally killed their best defenders to secure internal political peace,
which guaranteed external vulnerability. You have an army of 1 million men led by generals who are too scared to actually win decisively, and this structural weakness led to one of the most disastrous strategic blunders in military history.
Throughout the Northern Song period, they existed in a state of tense, heavily militarized peace with the Liao dynasty, a powerful nomadic empire to their northeast. The Song paid them massive annual tributes of silver and silk to keep them from invading.
Right, paying them off.
But the Song had also intelligently created an extensive geographic defense. They
Yeah.
cultivated a vast, dense defensive forest along the northern border, specifically designed to thwart Khitan cavalry attacks from the Liao.
A giant artificial forest designed to tangle up and stop horses. That's a brilliant piece of strategic engineering.
It was highly effective. But then, a subject tribe living under the Liao, the Jurchens, rebelled. The Jurchens formed their own militarized state called the Jin dynasty. The civilian scholars in the Song court saw an opportunity for revenge against the Liao.
Okay, I see where this is going.
They decided to forge an alliance with the newly formed Jin dynasty. The plan was to jointly attack and finally destroy their old enemy, the Liao, and reclaim some lost historical territories.
Classic realpolitik.
Hmm.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Exactly. But to launch their northern expedition army and physically link up with the Jurchens for the joint assault, the Song forces did something incredibly foolish. They removed that vast defensive forest they had planted on their northern border to clear a path for their own troops.
They literally chopped down their own shield to swing their sword.
Yes. Now, the joint campaign was initially successful. The Song and the Jurchens destroyed the Liao dynasty together by 1125. But during this campaign, the Jurchens fought alongside the Song army, and they observed firsthand just how poorly organized, poorly led, and politically weak the Song military actually was.
They realized it was a paper tiger.
They did. So the Jurchens immediately broke the alliance and turned their army south against the Song.
And because the Song had chopped down their defensive forest, there was absolutely nothing stopping the Jurchen cavalry from sweeping south.
Nothing but open plains. In what is historically known as the Jinkang Incident of 1127, the Jin army marched rapidly across the now treeless North China Plain. They besieged and completely captured the impregnable capital of Kaifeng.
Just like that.
They captured the retired Emperor Huizong, his successor Emperor Qinzong, most of the imperial court, and thousands of scholars and artisans, marching them all back north as prisoners. It was a total, humiliating collapse of the Northern Song.
It is a classic, devastating example of short-term political gain leading to catastrophic long-term ruin. The irony is just heartbreaking. They had explosive bombs, a million-man army, boundless wealth, but because they didn't trust their own generals and destroy their own geographic defenses, they lost half their empire in the blink of an eye.
The loss of the North forced the remnants of the court, mainly a younger prince who managed to escape into a desperate, chaotic retreat south across the massive Yangtze River.
Which changes everything.
It sets the stage for the second act of our story, the Southern Song era. Because down in the south, establishing their new capital at Hangzhou, the Song dynasty didn't just survive, they experienced a dramatic economic and military rebirth.
They realized they couldn't rely solely on massive, poorly led land armies anymore, especially against northern horse cavalry. The Yangtze River was their new shield. So in 1132, the Southern Song established China's first permanent standing navy.
A huge shift in strategy.
And they didn't just build a few rowboats to patrol the riverbanks. They sponsored massive state shipbuilding projects to protect the coast and facilitate maritime trade abroad, with Song merchant ships reaching as far as East Africa and the Red Sea.
Their nautical engineering was just as advanced as their astronautical clock towers. Song naval ships were marvels of engineering. They featured watertight bulkhead compartments.
Explain how that works, because that's crucial for naval warfare.
So instead of the hull being one large empty cavern, the interior of the ship was divided by heavy wooden walls into separate sealed compartments.
Okay.
If the ship struck a reef or was rammed by an enemy vessel and the hull was breached, only one compartment would flood. The rest of the ship remained buoyant, meaning it wouldn't sink.
That's brilliant.
They also had stern-mounted rudders that could be mechanically raised and lowered for different water depths, allowing them to navigate both deep oceans and shallow riverways.
And for river combat against the Jin dynasty, they built swift, paddle-wheel-driven naval vessels.
Yes, paddle wheelers powered by men operating treadmills inside the ship.
Like 12th century riverboats, but heavily armored and bristling with weapons. And they mounted traction trebuchets on the decks to launch those gunpowder bombs we talked about. This new high-tech navy was put to the ultimate test in 1161 at the battles of Tongdao and Kaishi on the Yangtze River.
A legendary clash.
The Jin forces from the north tried to invade the south to finish the Song off once and for all. The numbers from the source are insane. The Jin boasted a massive fleet of 600 warships carrying 70,000 men. The Song defensive forces had only 120 warships and 3,000 men.
It was a massive mismatch in manpower.
Yeah.
But the Song ships were paddle wheelers, meaning they were incredibly fast and maneuverable regardless of wind direction, and they had the gunpowder bombs. The destructive, terrifying power of the explosives bursting on the wooden gin decks, combined with the rapid hit-and-run assaults of the paddle wheelers, allowed the Song's 3,000 Marines to absolutely decimate the Jin invasion force.
A stunning, miraculous victory. It proved that the Southern Song could hold their borders using a combination of superior technology and geography. And they needed every single ounce of that naval superiority because a new foe was rising over the northern steppes.
The Mongol.
A foe that would forge the most terrifying, unstoppable war machine in human history.
Led first by Genghis Khan, the Mongols swept across Asia, redefining warfare. They conquered the Jin dynasty in the north by 1234, effectively doing to the Jurchens what the Jurchens had done to the Liao.
Full circle.
And then the Mongols turned their eyes south toward the rich, fertile lands of the Song. What follows is one of the most grueling, desperate, decades-long defenses in military history.
We often think of the Mongol conquest as a rapid, unstoppable blitzkrieg across the map. But the Song dynasty held them off for over 40 years.
They did. While the Mongols conquered Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and the Middle East with relative ease, the geography of southern China neutralized the Mongols' primary advantage, their light cavalry.
Because of the terrain.
Exactly. The south was heavily intersected by wide rivers, deep lakes, muddy rice paddies, and thousands of canals. Horses are useless in a swamp.
True.
The Mongols had to adapt. They had to engage in protracted, brutal siege warfare against heavily fortified Song cities, and they had to learn how to build and operate their own navy. It was a massive, bloody struggle of attrition.
It was so brutal that in 1259, the Mongol leader, Mungke Khan, the absolute ruler of the Mongol Empire, actually died from illness or a battle wound while besieging the Song's Dayayu castle in Chongqing.
Which bought the Song a temporary, desperate reprieve while the Mongols retreated to sort out their succession. But then came Kublai Khan.
Right.
And Kublai was a brilliant strategist. He understood that to break the Song, he couldn't just bash his head against random fortress walls. He had to control the Yangtze River, the main artery of the empire.
He blockaded the river and besieged the massive twin fortress cities of Shenyang and Fancheng from 1268 to 1273.
A 5-year siege. It was the last major obstacle protecting the rich Yangtze Basin. Kublai brought in Muslim engineers from the Middle East to build massive counterweight trebuchets that could hurl huge stones to crush the Song walls.
And once that fell,
Once Xinjiang finally fell, the defensive line was broken. The Mongol forces, now employing northern Chinese infantry, their own massive river fleets, and using the very same gunpowder weapons the Song had invented, pushed relentlessly south. By 1276, the glittering capital of Hangzhou fell.
but the Song didn't surrender entirely. The remnants of the loyal court, protecting the last remaining ruler, a 13-year-old boy named Emperor Zhao Bing, fled to the southern coast, seeking refuge on the water. And this leads to the tragic final climax in 1279, the naval battle of Yamen on the Pearl River Delta.
It was a massive, desperate naval engagement. The Song chained their fleet of 1,000 ships together across the bay to form a wooden fortress on the water, hoping to hold out.
It's a bold strategy.
But the Yuan army, led by Kublai's general Xing Hongfan, outmaneuvered them, launched fire ships, and eventually boarded the chained vessels. They systematically crushed the last pocket of Song resistance.
Realizing the battle was lost, and that the dynasty was entirely, irrevocably finished, the Song prime minister, a man named Lu Xiufu, took the 13-year-old emperor Zhao Bing.
This is hard to hear.
Rather than allow the emperor to be captured and humiliated by the Mongols, Lu Xiufu strapped the boy to his back, leaped into the sea, and committed suicide. The sources state that upon seeing this, approximately 1,300 members of the royal clan, concubines, and loyal officials followed them, throwing themselves into the water.
The emotional weight of that moment is just staggering. It is the violent, definitive end to an era of unparalleled administrative sophistication and intellectual brilliance.
Imagine being on one of those Mongol ships in the Pearl River Delta, watching it happen. You are watching the combination of 3 centuries of history, the civilization that gave the world paper money, the pioneers of empirical forensic science, the engineers who built astronomical clocks and paddle wheel ships, and it's all sinking into the dark water.
It's a sobering reminder of the fragility of civilization.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, let's look at the final takeaways.
Right.
Why should you, the listener, care about the intricacies of the Song dynasty today? Because they shouldn't just be a footnote in history as a dynasty that eventually fell to Kublai Khan.
Absolutely not.
They were, in almost every measurable way, the prototype for the modern state. They dealt with the very same systemic problems we struggle with right now. How do you manage and feed a massive, dense urban population? How do you regulate a complex, speculative paper economy without causing hyperinflation?
Right.
And how do you govern when your highly educated political class is locked in intense, toxic polarization? They grappled with these issues 1,000 years ago, and in the process, they gave us the compass, movable type printing, forensic science, and the formula for gunpowder.
And my core takeaway brings us back to the broader philosophy of the dynasty itself. Knowledge is only valuable when it is applied effectively and understood in its full context.
Well said.
The story of the Song dynasty proves a vital, timeless lesson about statecraft. A society can be technologically supreme, economically booming, and culturally brilliant, but it remains incredibly fragile if its political and strategic foundations are fundamentally flawed.
The structural issues.
Yeah, their deep paranoia of their own military, their structural inability to trust their best generals, and their short-sighted diplomatic betrayals like chopping down that defensive forest ultimately doomed a society that was centuries ahead of its time.
It is a profound historical lesson, but I want to leave you with a chilling postscript to explore on your own. We talked about the young 13-year-old emperor dying at the Battle of Yamen. But what happened to the rest of the royal family?
It's a wild story.
Well, Kublai Khan surprisingly spared the deposed Emperor Gong, who was an older brother that had been captured a few years earlier when Hangzhou fell. Kublai gave him a minor title, demoted him, and exiled him to Tibet to become a Buddhist monk. It seems like a quiet, surprisingly peaceful end for a fallen ruler, right?
It does, relatively speaking.
But decades later, Kublai's great-great-grandson, Gejin Khan, took the Mongol throne. And gripped by the exact same political paranoia that always haunts usurpers, he forced the elderly monk, the last living ghost of the Song emperors, to commit suicide.
Wow.
It proves that even when you have conquered the entire known world, even when you possess the greatest empire in history, the ghost of a fallen, brilliant dynasty can still keep you awake at night.
A haunting end to a brilliant era.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.